the final segment. There's this topic, big topic, behavioral chain analysis. And I know you guys range from a lot of levels of experience. How many of you would you say are in the situation where you would appreciate some sort of basic teaching about what is behavioral chain analysis? What are the ingredients of it? How do you do it? Sort of as if you haven't done very many, or maybe not even. Raise your hand if you're in that category. Proudly. You don't have to. I saw somebody do this. There's nothing wrong with that. Right. How many people have done just lots of behavioral chain analysis, and so it's very familiar to what it is, especially all the basics? Probably.
Still have a lot to learn, though.
Right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot to learn. All right. I'll tell you why I'm asking is that I have a fair number of slides on this with a lot of teaching points ranging from basic to more advanced as they go along. And then there's also getting back to the patient. There's another segment of that interview that includes behavioral chain analysis. That would chew up some of the time, and I hate to have you not get some of the teaching of stuff. So I'll just tell you my wise mind at this moment, having done that. It's not linear how I got to this point, but is that actually I'm going to start out just going with the slides. I want you to know what you should know about behavioral chain analysis. See how the pace goes, and if I can't get to that by the end, then tomorrow morning, especially I'll pick one of the segments where there's more room, and I'll put in. We'll watch some of the video to demonstrate where behavioral chain with her. Okay. Okay. Behavioral chain analysis. I'll just say as an analogy that this is like if you come from Massachusetts and you make a trip to Los Angeles and you drove. And somehow you ended up in Montana. That would be the equivalent of a problem behavior. But you really don't know where the most important problem behavior was along the line. You don't know if it was a mistake of making a right turn in Kansas or in Nevada. I don't know my geography of the Southwest as well as I know some parts of the country. Nevada's in the Southwest. Yes, it's between, I don't know about where it is, but, in other words, it could be that you got into a gas station and you came out and you went the wrong direction. There's so many things that went into ending up in Montana that someone wouldn't know. So if you have a patient that intends not to cut herself, and then she cuts herself during the week, she's like in Montana. So the behavioral chain analysis is that step-by-step, link-by-link analysis of what the antecedents were step-by-step, what the choices were, what the automatic behaviors were that resulted in ending up cutting rather than not cutting, or rather than calling the therapist and getting coaching about cutting, or whatever else might have been the alternative, using skills instead of cutting. So that's really to make it simple, because it is a simple idea. It gets complex in the doing sometimes, but it's really a link-by-link analysis. And as somebody who was originally trained in psychoanalytic treatment, it's really helpful, though not totally true, but it's a helpful way to structure the thinking about it, that when you're doing psychodynamically oriented treatments, you're going from here down to deeper levels. You're looking for the deeper level from which the pain is coming. And you're looking for the underlying object relation scenarios or self-pathology or mentalization problems. You're going down, and you sort of gradually like peeling the onion and getting into, from your point of view as a psychodynamic person, a deeper place. Your goal might be the same, but you're doing it that way, whereas a behaviorist is going horizontally. And you should be able to find everything in both models, but you go about it different ways. And that required a change of thinking for me. What I just told you was helpful to me. Once I started thinking, this is horizontal. This is the way I think in other areas of my life other than therapy. Like if my sink, I can't shut off my sink, my faucet. You know, I started thinking link by link. What are the links that go to the faucet dripping? You know, or as a doctor, somebody has abdominal pain. When did it start? What's going on then? What have you done for it? How has it evolved since then? What happens if I push it this way? You know, and what have been the consequences of having that pain? Oh, you're a teenager and you resulted in not going to school that day. So maybe that could be playing some kind of role too in it, along with other things. So it's, you know, it's a horizontal analysis, link by link, and from a fairly straightforward point of view, it's not a complicated idea. It's just, it gets more complicated and subtle and interesting as you get into it, because it not only is this link by link assessment of the controlling variables, the steps in the chain, the patterns that go into the problem behavior, and the patterns that would go into adaptive behavior. It's kind of like another chain that could come off this chain, is how can we get from this chain to another chain? DBT, a lot of it is like work with the chain gang. Sort of think you're trying to reduce some chains and build other chains, is what the treatment's all about. But it's more than that, because the chain analysis in DBT is also the centerpiece technique of your session, especially in stage 1, when you keep having problem target behaviors coming up. The highest target behavior, you do a behavioral chain analysis on it in order to sort out the variables that you then want to do something about. It's also a platform for treatment. While you're doing chain analysis, you actually are encountering the links in the chain. And as you encounter them, you're seeing about the possibility of finding solutions, either right then and there when you get there, or later when you come back to it, depending on clinical judgment and all kinds of things. All right? It's also very arbitrary exactly what the chain is. It isn't like somebody finds the chain and someone else doesn't find the chain. You find different chains. And even the same therapist may find 2 different chains, 2 different times they do the same scenario. So I don't want you to think it isn't like, oh, there's the real chain that the experts find, and then there's the chains that people who aren't experts get off, somewhere else. People have done things like have the same patient present, or same actual therapist. This is a colleague in Massachusetts, and who's a DBT fabulous trainer, Elizabeth Simpson. And Liz got really interested in this, and she decided to be a patient, come up with a scenario that would be the same one, and go around and have different DBT experts do a chain analysis on that exact incident, because she wanted to see if they all ended up the same place. Not even close. So don't think that there is the chain to discover. The chain there's no such thing as the chain. It's a way to structure your thinking in order to generate good data, in order to find choice points, in order to pinpoint solutions, and then in order to try to implement those solutions and see how it works for the future. I mean, in other words, it's just part of a process of figuring it out, trying to make changes. And when you pick a chain, what let's see, got an eraser. I've got this. Those of you that I'll try to tell you what I'm doing here if you can't see it. So again, it's not going to be a hard time. I'm not going to put a lot of detail on here. But if this is the chain, I'm not very technologically much of a wizard yet, but actually, because I'm doing a lot of workshops now independently, I used to rely on a company that generated all these materials, so I'm now becoming a PowerPoint fanatic. Just at the point when most people are sick of PowerPoint and it's supposed to be going out, I'm like getting it and figuring out how you make chains and things and stuff. So I've been doing these really cool chains. And if this is the chain that I'm analyzing, let's say here is where you were wanting to go, but actually ended up here in Montana instead of California, started in Massachusetts. So if this is the chain, though, life is a chain. It never stops being a chain. So I usually think for purposes of clinical usefulness, around 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 of the way over, that's where I want to see my problem behavior. 3/4 problem behavior is the whole point of the chain. You don't just do a chain. You do a chain in order to analyze the variables or links that are most important in determining the problem behavior. If the problem behavior goes away, you don't even do the chain on this. You do a chain on another problem behavior. So here you are with the problem. Here's something. The problem behavior is over here. Why do I want it over a little bit, like 3/4 of the way to the right? Just for purposes of usefulness, is I want room on the left to have a whole series of antecedent links, including what we're going to call vulnerability factors, and then a prompting event, and a whole bunch of links that lead up to the problem behavior. And I want to have room over on the right to have the consequences of the problem behavior, because that's part of our analysis. It's as simple as that. And so, but really, of course, this diagram of this chain would have to start infinitely down that way and go infinitely down that way. So it's just that that's not very useful clinically most of the time. I have to tell you, when I was running my inpatient DBT unit, we did a lot of things. We had a rash of self-cutting behaviors. So I had made the staff, this is like asking the Senate to come in when they're supposed to be on vacation. I had the staff come in starting at 8 in the morning on a Friday, and we all agreed we were going to stay as long as it took to figure out what the controlling variables were of the rash of cutting on my inpatient unit. And we sat in the room, all staff, all patients, and we put up butcher paper around the whole room. And we started with diagramming, what happened a year ago, what happened a week ago, what happened. And we had a whole chain that we all participated in, went all the way around the room. And then we looked at all the points, and everybody argued about which of the things were making the real difference. Oh, it was when that change in the dietitian was. She was the key to this. That would be like the right turn in Kansas. No, it was when that patient was discharged. She played a key role on this unit in helping all of us feel better. And now she's gone, and we hate the staff. Oh, okay, so you did these links. It was a very interesting thing to do. People got quite exhausted, and the cutting totally went away. I don't know why. I don't think it was. We did discover a lot of possible causes and patterns, and we all noticed them, and we all got tired. We all wanted to get out of it, and somehow it stopped it all. Problem behaviors here, and there's links in the chain. There's a prompting event. I'll just put PE here. It's a very important part of the chain. And there are the vulnerability factors in the chain, which are all those things going on before the trigger comes along, the prompting event, the stimulus, the cue, whatever it is that you want to call it. But mostly we call it the prompting event. That's a good neutral term. It doesn't belong to any particular theory. So a prompting event happens here, and it set off a bunch of emotions, thoughts, actions, and events in the environment, and more emotions, and more thoughts, and more events, and urges, and skills, and all kinds of stuff, until eventually, for some reason, the problem behavior occurs. And after the problem behavior occurs, there are consequences to the problem behavior, some of which might reinforce future episodes of the problem behavior, and you really want to know about those. So this is the whole point. This is what it looks like. Not in your session. It's a dialogue. It's the way it looks in my head. And the reason it's really good, if you've got a good, rigid idea of what it is, this is another dialectic. If you're really clear, rigid, and impulsive about your chain of events, you can afford to be very flexible and clinically astute in your interventions with the patient. So that you don't have to say, okay, what happened next? Okay, then what happened? Okay, then what happened? Until you both are exhausted and feel like you're, in a trap of some kind, a behavioral analysis trap. Whereas my patients, or new patients, would say, what are you going to do? Hit me over the head with another behavioral analysis? They would use that terminology. And when I started to hear that, I had staff meetings and said, this is a problem. If that's their perception of it, there's probably a kernel of truth in what they're saying. What are we doing with our chain analysis that makes people feel hit over the head? It's just a process of inquiry. And if we're doing it in an entrapped way or a rigid way, it's going to feel like it's an intrusion or an imposition. It's just a conversation. Your doctor has it if you come in with a sore throat. They just don't say, all right, I'm going to do behavioral analysis. How did you get that somewhere? And immediately you feel like you're under the gun. They just ask a few questions. So this is how it goes, and over here are the consequences of the problem behavior. These are the 5 ingredients, 5 categories of ingredients of the chain. Always know that if you're relatively new to this, there are vulnerability factors that render the person vulnerable to the prompting event. The prompting event is an encounter between the individual and the environment that sets off a chain of events that include emotions, cognitions, physiological changes, actions, events, and those are the categories really of all these links that go. A problem behavior might be cutting, it might be drinking, it might be some other problem behavior, binging or purging, and the consequences are, especially if you're interested in things that are reinforcing of the problem behavior, but you're also interested in consequences that somehow are inhibiting the emergence of a more adaptive behavior. Sometimes nobody would reinforce it if a person did an adaptive behavior. So that really is a quiet crime going on in that treatment, is this person never gets reinforced if they go to the trouble of trying to do something that's really constructive. You can't expect people to change their behavior with no reinforcement. So it's very important to look for reinforcers of the problem behavior, but also things that might be inhibiting, extinguishing, or punishing alternative possibilities. Okay, this is the chain. This is the basic idea of the chain. And for those one step further on this, if you've done DBT more, the chain, interestingly and helpfully, is also the format for case conceptualization. So after I do 5 chains on somebody's self-cutting, what am I learning? I'm learning, gee, every time they cut themselves, this particular vulnerability factor starts to happen. They got terrible sleep last night. They drank a shitload of coffee and soda that day. They got a terrible phone call from their mother that morning. They were really stressed. And maybe there's 3 links here that keep happening, and you start to recognize there's a pattern here that's associated with the problem behavior. Or not. If this one patient that after I developed inpatient DBT, I developed a day treatment program with staff where we had 35 beds, a day treatment program for people with borderline personality disorder. We did it all in a DBT way. And in that, we at a certain point we had a patient who was always get upset. She'd run out of the day room during a meeting. And she'd run out, and then typically what would happen is she had a lot of friends in the group of patients, and they would, 1 or 2 of them would follow her out. And they'd comfort her. She'd go down the hall, she'd bang her head, she'd wail, she'd sit on the floor in a fetal position, and they'd come and crowd around her and take care of her. And she would be a good person to do that with because we felt like, and so when we started looking at what was going on with her in a team meeting, we decided, we can't have people, this is a huge reinforcer. We can't have people running out of the room after her. She runs out of the room, that is her choice. Okay? But we don't want to reinforce running out of the room by any of us running out of the room. So we, as part of her treatment and in general, decided this is a good rule for us to have as a program. Except under very exceptional circumstances. If anyone leaves the room, you're on your own. There are rooms down the hall where you can look up skills. You can call your individual therapist and try to get coaching. If you can get hold of him or her, whatever. There's opportunities. None of us is going to go out with you. So when you figure out that that's part of the pattern, that's a reinforcer for the problem behavior. Now you start to get into, I've done 5-chain analysis. I'm starting to see some patterns. Now let's start raising questions about those patterns. Ideally, you raise them with the patient. Say, hey, I noticed this pattern. What do you think? I had a patient, I did chain analysis after chain analysis on her suicide attempts and self-harming behaviors. She lived in a residential program, a group home in Western Massachusetts. She was 33 years old, and I mentioned her before. She was the one who would now ended up with DID and would self-immolate and strangulate and stuff like that. Turned out, after a bunch of chain analysis, there was a common element in the chain that neither of us had ever thought of until one day when I was going over and I was sort of reviewing her chains and looking at them thinking, what is this here? I mean, you know, if you've been in supervision with partial income, and things are not getting better, which is a lot of the time. And then you say, hey, Marcia, don't you think maybe we should move on to a different target for a while? I mean, we're not getting anywhere on this one. There's so many other things to treat. You know, she'll give me the deep shit that, sweetie, if you want to do DBT, you treat the highest priority target behavior and you assess it with behavioral chain analysis. What can I say? You do that for 15 years if you need to, if you want to do DBT. If you don't want to do DBT, or you want to do a hybrid treatment, absolutely shift over. You could do that. And that's really your choice, if you know what you say. It's actually not that flexible. I'm saying DBT is supervision. So then it's right. She says, instead you should be asking a different question. What's left out of this? What am I missing? Where is the link? What's the hidden link? What's that hot link that's on the ground that you're not finding? Open your eyes, open your awareness, do another chain, be aware, be ready for that. Well, if I start looking at the chains, this person is not changing much in his behavior. And lo and behold, she, I say to her on that, no, I was looking through all the recent chains, and it seems like in every chain there's some reference to your body during this sort of early part of the chain. And, you know, and I know that even to mention that, I can just feel that brings up a lot for you, even to say that much. I wonder if you're aware of that. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, like, you and the group home went on a trip on that day that you really did that severe suicide attempt. And on that trip, you guys went to the beach. When you went to the beach, you went sunbathing and swimming. And so you told me you got a sunburn. That was all it was. And then on this you did this, and on this you had that, and on that one you couldn't find any clothes that fit anymore because you don't like your body, and you referred to that. I started realizing the references to body in the chain, and it turned out that was actually quite important. Any reference to the body, it's like a cue. This is someone whose mother took over her body sexually for many years. And she was a brilliant kid, valedictorian in high school, went to Brown University, and in her freshman year, when suddenly away from home, it started to flood her the images of what her mother did with her. She couldn't stand it, she jumped off a balcony and tried to kill herself for the first time ever. And she went into a hospital, which began a series of hospitalizations, so that 85% of her next 10 years she was in hospitals, mostly state hospitals after they ran out of money. So it's sort of like, and her body was, I mean, just all she had to do was think of her body, and she would want to kill herself. So we realized that, and just realizing, so it's a very useful thing to do the chains, keep track of the chains, keep the data. They're useful just to structure a session. They're even more useful if you write them down over time. You saw me in that video with Terry. You can see me with a piece of paper. I'm writing down what's going on, including the chains. And so I just do that automatically right now. I used to do it on the whiteboard too with some of my patients, where I'll get up there and say, let's go over it, and we'll elicit the chain. Make it very public and obvious, and then invite the patient to come up and take a marker and write things in, and you end up with a really interesting chain. And the patient says, well, no, that's not how I do. Let's put this here. Then you know you've got someone invested in being a collaborating scientist to figure this out, which is really the atmosphere. You want a validating atmosphere and a collaborative relationship as scientists together, figuring this out and trying to make changes. So basically doing the chain, following the chain, doing it however works for a patient. Some patients I would not do that with. It just depends on the person. You can tell some people like that and would go with that. Other people, it's almost exposure exercise. They don't really want to do that, or they just think it's superfluous. So I just wanted to go introduction, and now this will allow me to run through a bunch of slides. and not overdo spending a ton of time on each slide, but I've told you some of the main points that are the basics of chain analysis. Okay, so this one, I'll just quickly look at things as we go. It's an assessment, it's for case conceptualization, it's a platform of retrieval. You jump on and off the chain to retrieve. Everything's on the chain. Your biosocial theory is on the chain. In other words, the person's vulnerability is played out on the chain. The invalidating environment enters into the chain. The primary treatment targets, problem behaviors, are on the chain. All kinds of problematic cognitions and consequences or contingencies, emotions, skills, deficits, they're all on the chain. And the adaptive responses are on the chain, and you want to highlight those as you go along. Don't just look for dirt. Say, wow, you were doing great up to this point. Look at how many things you did. You thought of calling me. You actually placed a call. I wasn't available right then. You realized that I wasn't available right then, and you tried to hang in there, even though you were devastated about the fact that your boyfriend went off to a party that you couldn't go to because you were sick. So, then you sort of got involved running around your apartment trying to catch your cat, which is a really good distracting exercise because you almost never can catch your cat. But then you got really frustrated because you couldn't catch your cat, and you suddenly had the devastating thought, not only do people don't want me at the party, which is not true, I thought, but my cat doesn't want to. So now the distracting exercise has turned into a trigger for more sense of shame and rejection. So then she tried this. I said, let's not lose track of the fact that even though you ended up in a hospital and you did hurt yourself, you made like 27 good tries here. You get points, So look for those. Here's how it fits. I sort of walked you through this, but labeling it so you understand. This is like this is like a book in the Bible at DBT, this little page. For those of you who don't know DBT yet, this was a very important page to me because as a person who didn't come from cognitive behavioral therapy, this is like all of cognitive behavioral therapy on one page in DBT. Not that it's all there, but it gives you all the topic headlines. You do behavioral chain analysis. It's also sequential. You do behavioral chain analysis on a problem behavior. You do it again. You do it again. What comes out of that? Insight. What does insight mean in DBT? It means that you start to recognize patterns. As somebody who came from psychoanalysis, insight and interpretation had a much bigger meaning. In DBT, it means you see them like this happens. When these two things happen, this happens. And you bring it to the patient's attention. Hey, did you notice that? Yeah, I noticed that. Did you notice it's also... You're sort of seeing patterns because you're going to be trying to change patterns. You get these insight strategies and you highlight them. Then you move on from highlighting insight strategies to highlighting patterns, which generates insight and helps you have hypotheses of what's going on, and then you can check them out in various ways. And you move from that to starting to generate solutions. So if the pattern is somebody runs out of a room and everybody follows, let's just say that's a single part of the chain. Okay, now you start saying, can we think of any solutions for that? I might say to the patient, well, I really want people to come out of the room. I feel loved by my friends. I don't want my friends to just leave me alone. Yeah, but is it possible that in doing that, actually, without you intending to, it's actually keeping the cycle? I don't know, maybe. So maybe we should consider interrupting that and changing that. That solution analysis, that one, would be one of the types of change procedures. We're spending tomorrow morning on the 4 types of change procedures and what they look like and how you do them. And so there's these 4 types of change procedures that basically are the menu of interventions to change behavior in cognitive therapy. This is what was so useful to me. I just started realizing I have to learn cognitive therapy. Is that fun? I have to learn the principles of skills training and learn DBT skills. That's another one. I have to learn exposure procedures because they're used in so many things. That's another one, exposure. And I have to learn contingency management, the manipulation of consequences as a way of changing behaviors that are contingent on those consequences, or that goes to vice versa. But I have to turns out that there's readings that are really good on each each of those things, I started thinking, okay, this is my curriculum to become a DBT therapist. As somebody who started out psychodynamics, I've got to go through and understand everything on this page, including didactic strategies, which is basically being a mini professor, in the middle of a session, bringing important information about treatment, research, pathology, and things, and then orienting strategy, which means now that we're going to do exposure, I've got to orient the client to exposure. Going to do skills training, I'm going to give the rationale for why we're doing skills training and what it's going to be like. So, and then ultimately I got to get commitment that that's what we're going to do and try to strengthen the commitment. So this page is just like a non-stop, constant menu in the innards of doing DBT in individual therapy. I already told you where it fits in the therapy session. You do that authority, you do the diary part review, you create the agenda. The agenda is going to be prioritizing the highest priority target behavior that happened that week. And then you're going to do a behavioral chain analysis. And you're going to say, hey, let's look at what happened this week. And then you start to get a description of the behavior. I wish you could see the new one I did of this yesterday while I was on the airplane. This is a terrible diagram I made, but it shows the elements. If you can read it on your things, I don't know. It's so fancy. But it just shows what I showed up here. Vulnerability fact, prompting event, links in the chain, problem behavior, consequences. Those are the 5 segments. This adds nothing to what I've said. I've already covered this essentially. Literally everything. So let me move on. How about the order that you do a chain analysis? There is a kind of a sequence, but there's a lot of flexibility. The sequence that you might want to have as your sort of like first draft of behavioral chain analysis would go like this. I would start by eliciting what the problem behavior was and the detail and the methodology of the problem behavior what happened? Did it hurt? How long did it go on? Did you have to go to the emergency room? I don't want to get into the rest of the story. I want to get sort of a description of the problem behavior because that's the thing we're targeting. I want to know really exactly what it is we're targeting. I cut myself 30 times, she said. Et cetera. Did it hurt? Yeah, 5 minutes, but then it created, a bliss. Okay. Did you go to the emergency? No, I didn't. But you were bleeding a lot? Yes. Okay, so why didn't you do that? Well, it was too late by the time I thought it would create an infection if they sewed it up. So I took care of it with myself, my own little kit for cutting. Got my cutting knife, I got some cutting pick. I got my whole protocol, I know she's like an expert. So I get the problem behavior, and what do I get next? Usually the prompting event. I get the prompting event, I kind of say, hey, this came about Friday in the evening. Is there anything that happened during that day that you think was sort of the beginning of the pathway that led to that? Like the thing that's tipped the balance. And she actually has one. I think whether we get to this or not, she was listening to a radio show. And somebody shared a story on the radio show, so apparently some kind of talk show. And it was something that bore some resemblance to the way her father and her brother used to abuse her. And that got home. That was the prompting event. And then it was like it created momentum developed down the chain. So I get the prompting event. Actually, if you do see any of this tomorrow, when I first asked her what set up the motion, she said, I started to have terrible thoughts. Now that's not an interaction with the environment. I started having terrible thoughts, or I woke up with a bad dream or something. Here's this terrible thought. What are the thoughts? I started getting it. I wasn't thinking this is the prompting event I'm having. I want a prompting event that somehow reflects her interaction with the world around her. It's really a radical behavioral point of view. Well, Skinner started, and really you want to see how behavior came from the interaction with the environment, and then you want to see how the behavior goes back into the environment and affects change there. It sort of gives you a sort of a set of hypotheses about what's going on. So, okay. Get the prompting in. From this point, you now realize there's 3 more segments to get. There's the links in the chain that are between those 2 things. There's the vulnerability factors that went way over to the left. And there's the consequences over to the right. You know, it's a crapshoot at that point. It's clinical judgment. Sometimes in the middle of getting a problem, the patient starts to tell you the links in the chain. And just go with it. Sometimes the patient, it's talk about the prompting event, says that I was having a really bad day when that happened. Just tell me about that. Just because that's where they're going. And I can get the data either way. That's where I said I can be flexible if I know that it's back in my head and not as flexible. I'm building a chain that I could diagram rigidly, but then interact with the patient. Okay, let's hear about the consequences. See exactly what I'm talking about that. So this just structures you, but it doesn't tell you what to do every minute. In fact, if it does, it'll turn out to be oppressive. Okay. So prompting event next. That's what this slide is about. You don't want a prompting event like all of this started when my great-great-grandfather came to this country. That couldn't have been a prompting event. It couldn't. I mean, it's so arbitrary that that might be somebody's prompting event. Yes, it was. If he had never come to this country, you probably wouldn't have gone through what you went through and your family wouldn't have, but that's not clinically useful. What's useful is something in the last few hours. So there's a million candidates. You want something that stands out that the patient agrees was a significant event, and that gives you a chance to analyze a certain segment that's analyzable in one session if possible. This is just a set of ideas about how to try to elicit a prompting event by asking what began the script, what set things rolling. You just develop your own language for this. What was the turning point? And then you move on to one of the next 3 segments. So the slides are not catching up with what I've already said. You move on to one of these segments, and you could move to any of them. The vulnerability factors, for those who don't know exactly what this is, there's a wide range of categories. I said anything that renders a person vulnerable to the prompting event. So that this person who ran out of the room, and what I'm alluding to, ran out of the room when I made an announcement in our day treatment program. I announced in our day treatment program that I was leaving the program in 3 months to move to Western Massachusetts from New York. And this patient was so, she's a 19-year-old girl, was so connected to me that she ran out of the room before the announcement. We all gathered in the room. That's already a bad context in the mental health program. We're having a special meeting so that Charlie can make an announcement. This is not good news. Is he dying, sick, or is he leaving? I mean, that's like 9 times out of 10 it It isn't going to be something else. So she ran out of the room. Somebody who really relied on my presence in many ways. A girl from Albany, New York, who was really saved by her basketball coach in high school when she had a completely neglectful upbringing. And she got very connected to being around basketball, which I was very connected to. And she began, I think, to sort of think of me as the replacement of her coach, who died of a heart attack on the floor during a practice during her senior year of high school, which set off her series of hospitalizations for the first time in her life. So the idea that I would announce I was dying or leaving, she was out of the room before I got the announcement. And she's down the hall and the surgeon following her. So you can see the hypothesis that it's the friends following her that keeps reinforcing this is not all that's going on. And it never is. There's also stuff from the left end of the chain that are pushing her here. Right? Once you start to get more sophisticated with this and you get more data, then you've got down at the left end of the chain the prompting event, which was I have an announcement to make, is the prompting event. In her mind, in her experience, is linked to coach diet. As we learned later, and as I learned later in many talks with her before I left. So she's thinking coach diet, this is classical conditioning in behaviors. These 2 things are stimuli that are like pinging back and forth with each other. And coach diet is triggering an emotional response that's dramatic and it's just about killer. So that gets going into here. So now the chain gets more interesting. It isn't just what's on the sort of obvious Now this has to be understood to realize why she's so panicked. She was so upset she couldn't even put it into words. She ran down, banging her head down there. She also had the thought that this means I'm going to die. That's a cognition. She actually had that thought. This is it. He's going to die. Everybody who I care about is going to die. So that goes on. But in her case, when you did a chain analysis with her, she also, as she did every day, walked around with these giant soda things called Jolt. And she's carrying her Jolt around with massive caffeine all day long. She's about this big, very stocky, moving around all the time. And she's like, her legs are going all the time. She's bothered with everybody else. She's like this. And she's drinking Jolt and she's drinking other stuff. And she doesn't sleep at night. These are all vulnerability factors. And also a vulnerability factor was she lost the coach and was left with unresolved grief. And that set her up for this being a terrible broken event. Even though I actually wasn't dying, I wasn't leaving for 3 months. We had a very rich 3 months, partly as a result of advertising this. And after I left to Western Massachusetts, she stayed in touch for 2 or 3 years and came up and saw me sometimes. So it actually was a very good experience for her at that moment. It was all linked together. So those are vulnerability factors. The most important thing about the links I want to say is when you do a chain analysis, you've got to be asking yourself, not just can I get all the links, but does this make sense? Does this story fit the rules of common sense? Because if it doesn't, you got to ask about that. That clues you in. There's something maybe off here, at least worth asking. Patient I had a lot of anger. She came out of the state hospital, 21 years old, and she had a lot of anger. She was getting her first job at Papa Gino's pizza restaurant in Northampton. She comes into a session and says, "You should see what I did to the boss." Oh no, what did you do to the boss? And I had these keys and I put them between my fingers like this, like sticking out from my knuckle, and I just clocked him, man. He just went right down. It's like, she was so proud of this thing. And I said, I don't suppose you still have that job. Well, I went down the street. I got one at what's that? Pizza, typical, it's a pizza chain. Yeah, I got a job the same day. No big deal. Oh, we did a chain analysis of this, and we went through it. So why did you hit him? Tell me the circumstances. She's going through the chain. He said this to me. He said that to me. I got to do this. He said I stole stuff from the factory. All this stuff was going on. And I was so pissed off at him. And so I hit him. That's the problem. She says, I was so pissed off at him, and I hit him. I had to stop. You didn't have to stop and hear me. Just let me listen. I said, every session I've had with you, you've been pissed off at something. That doesn't mean you hit him. So getting angry doesn't mean you hit someone, and especially that way. So there's something else going on. Well, yeah, of course there was. But what was that? The way he smirked at me. And that smirk turned out to be very important in her history and in her experience of him. And so they said, okay, that makes a little more sense to me. I'm still not fully getting how you got to that. But, so you listen and you say, wait a minute, that doesn't make, I don't get it. You ask for a little more. Boom, something pops out, maybe you get a little more. So that's, eliciting the links. It's a story. People don't think in links and chains. People think in stories. So you want to get the story. And you want the story to make sense. See, these are the rest of the things are more like now you've got the basics of chain analysis. Well, stop for a minute and let you ask any questions about, especially those of you, really anybody, about chain analysis. Think about the problems those of you who do chain analysis have with doing chains. And think of it, and if you're relatively new to this, see if this is making enough sense that you can walk out of it and do one of them. Just any sort of question. Yeah.
Well, I have a
So is this related to the behavioral chain analysis, or is this sort of
It relates to everything, but
it does relate to everything?
but I think it's well, I mean, I don't know how to address the food with the thirds, but I'm not sure how I know how common it is habits. I don't know what it means by
The dialectical. You know, I'll take a stab at this. There's a million ways to go about this. But one would be that when Linehan started in the late 70s and she wanted to apply CBT to suicidal patients, that was her passion, that was her interest. As we learned later, that was her own life history. She struggled with those kind of things herself, and she ended up devoting her career to trying to, as she has put it before, to get other people like me out of hell. Okay. And she trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. She applied cognitive behavioral therapy to the letters first. She was sort of a purist about it. She trained in the most hotbed of CBT and at that point in time. When she started doing it with her patients, it wasn't working very well because every time she would push them to try skills or change their thinking or expose to something, there would be so much pushback that she couldn't get anywhere. People would feel so invalidated that she wasn't listening to their stories of what they had been through and the suffering. And instead were being told, how about trying a cup of tea when you're suicidal? They felt so trivialized and invalidated and pissed off and band-aided to death that, and they would fight with her in sessions and they wouldn't do homework. So they were not good behavior therapy candidates in that respect. But she felt like this is still the right treatment, this is the science of behavior change. So I need to change something. She added in a lot of validations. So she would push, but as she put it at one point in her teachings, in order to get the bitter pill down in CBT, she would coat it with the sugar coating of validation and make it possible for her to push people by validating along the way. Turns out there's research that's demonstrated validation in its own right actually has a lot of powerful capacities to change people. But at that time, that's what she was thinking. Now that was a partial solution. It got better, but it was still common because of it. And here's where we're getting the dialectics and the basic idea of dialectics in it. When she would push people for change, they would be dysregulated because they felt they couldn't do it, didn't want to do it, felt mistreated by her, felt pushed around like they were in their families. And so she would then have to move in and validate them and say, no wonder you're upset. If she was too validating and accepting of it, they would rather quickly feel dysregulated by feeling hopeless because, oh, if you're telling me everything says it should be, and you can understand this, there must be no hope. And she realized, of course, these are understandable feelings, but it was such a problem for this patient population. We can all relate to those ideas. But for these guys, push, no. Oh, let me move in and validate you and be compassionate. The other person's, no. Oh, let me push you again. No. Because at a certain point in time, in the early 80s, it was a two-paradigm model. And then she started to gradually figure out, oh, I'm on the right track, but I've got to move quickly between acceptance and change, between pushing and validation. I've got to move quickly, and I've got to do it more creatively. I've got to do it almost at the same time. So I'm pushing and validating at the same time. And then she starts to develop that more into more different strategies, and she considered all of them to fall under the idea of dialectics, which was a suggestion made by her secretary at that moment in the history of DBT. She was passing around in her lab with her students, and her secretary overheard the conversation. We've got to find a name for these things we're doing and keep the movement going and keep synthesizing things and try to reconcile opposites and all this stuff. The secretary says, oh, my husband's in the philosophy department. That's dialectics. She said, this is it. And dialectic entered DBT at that moment. It's gone a lot of places in DBT, but the idea is these are people who've been so vulnerable emotionally and so reactive, and yet so invalidated that you can't push them much without losing the battle, and you can't accept them too much without losing the battle. You've got to find a balancing act, and you've got to be moving and find ways to bring together opposites. So there's a lot of ways dialectics is used now in the world of DBT. It comes up in everything. But that's where it started, that's the basic idea. You do a chain analysis, for instance, and the way I'm putting it, you really do a cognitive behavioral procedure. Boom, boom, boom. Link by link, we're figuring this out. We are scientists together, we have a destination here, we have discipline, we have a project on our side, and we're doing this thing. But actually, to do it that way with this patient population would feel like ramming a rod through their stomach, or something like that. It's like too oppressive, it's too rigid. This is like my family, where we couldn't speak during dinner. And so then it's sort of like, now how do you get being accepting, being warm, and move, and having a lot of flexibility, but never giving up the chain. That's the dialectical application of the chain. So that's sort of a stab. That's sort of where it comes from. That's how I think of it. That it actually has gone so many places that you couldn't have explained it other ways. Does that tell a good start? All right. And so the chain analysis, everything is on the chain. You really can't be dialectical in the doing of the chain. And that you almost have to be, not because it would have to be done that way if you're doing it with somebody who has PTSD, OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, or other things. Because if people don't have borderline personality disorder with this mercurial emotional dysregulation that can move this way or this way, depending on what you do, and you often feel you can't win. I mean, that's why dialectics is in DBT. And it wasn't developed in the treatment of OCD. You won't see the word, you won't see the concept. You see people being skillful, flexible, and stuff. But for Linehan, this is the center idea of the treatment. That's why I said, that's not the only reason why it's the first name of the book. That was also a marketing strategy. But, because she wanted it to be Zen behavior therapy, but the Gilbert Test told her that that's going to be a very small market. You call it Zen behavior therapy. So she called it something that no one understood. And philosophically, it made sense. And then it came to the world. Yes.
I heard that change can be aversive. But I've always thought, we have so many solutions to the analysis that are, we're reinforcing things right, I guess, towards their goal, and looking at what behaviors that make that happen.
Well, there's a lot in this question. I'll rephrase it for people. Is that we've heard that it's often the case that going through the chain analysis is aversive for the patient. Sometimes for the therapist too. And so here's my take on that. I think you can really go off the rails in your understanding of DBT if you don't get this right. It does tend to have an aversive impact, but that's not the point. The point is to do a microscopic look at the links in the chain. And you try to do it without making it especially aversive, as it is anyway. Because who wants to look at the links in your chain when you've done something that's a problem? I don't. I mean, oh boy, let's look at my dirty laundry that I did. No, it's aversive just to do it. You don't have to try to make it aversive. That is not a good idea. You want it to be a user-friendly thing you do, but actually, the person says, do we have to keep doing this? I didn't see that we're getting anywhere in this. This didn't teach me anything new, and I wanted to just tell you about my life. And sort of, it's like, I know what you mean. So it isn't like, yes, you have to do the change. It's more like, I know exactly what you mean. I think we both wish we didn't need to do this right now, because I want to know all about your life too. But actually, because these behaviors are still going actually a good method when it works well. We got to stick to this. Come on. Let's try to make it work. Now it's aversive. So then a person might come in and give a session, and in their diary card, they've given up their problem behavior. Or they're saying they gave it up. You don't know. And they come in and you say, it's a little bit of relief today. What do you want to talk about? Oh, thank God, we're in freedom right now. So there is an aversive natural quality to it that sometimes works very well towards the treatment because it motivates people to stop the behaviors in order to stop the chain from being active, in order to move on to other stuff. And I'm saying this because some people laugh. This actually works. It's not uncommon at all, for people to do that. They give up. I had a patient who gave up trichotillomania behaviors to some degree, hair pulling behaviors, when we tediously analyzed chain after chain after chain, then under Marcia's supervision, until I was sick of it, the patient was sick of it, and that's when I went to Marcia and said, why don't we just drop it? We're not getting any of this. It's like so tedious. I can tell you the chain before it happens. He said, that's the problem. You need beginner's mind every time you do the chain. You need to be ready to hear the thing you've never heard. And lo and behold, I ended up in the little that happened. But so it isn't. You don't try to make it aversive, and I'm glad you brought it up because I think this is one of the misunderstandings in DBT of chain analysis. It'll be aversive even if you try to make it fun. Yeah.
Sometimes it's a prompting event. I guess the harm because I know that it's not quite what I think it's deeper than what might be in the present moment or what the person thinks. Do you have any examples of prompting events or getting to a prompting event that might be further back in history, like in history, like 6 months before, 8 months before, that's not quite so obvious?
You mean less obvious than when my great-grandparents came over to this country as a prompting?
Yeah. I think that's like further back, but not. I mean, with Coach Diane, I think maybe gets you, but
I could come up with examples, but here's my main answer to this. Because she's asking more about the prompting event. Is that the prompting event could be anything about which you would say, if this hadn't happened, there's a good chance the problem behavior wouldn't happen. So there's a million things like that. It could have happened in Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, Kansas, anywhere along there. Any of them could have been seen as a prompting event, and even things 3 days ago. So let's say you had a phone call with a patient, would be an example. A patient called for skills coaching. They could tell that you were a little frustrated with them on the phone, but you didn't say so. But the patient, being highly sensitive emotionally, was very dysregulated by that phone call 3 days before the problem behavior. Then the problem behavior comes up, and something happens. They think of calling you, but decide, I don't want to. Are you kidding? I'm not calling this bitch because put myself through that again. Are you kidding? So what's the prompting event? You could say, if you're willing to widen your scope, the prompting event might have been to experience your frustration in the phone call. But that was 3 days ago. So you do want to know what that was. But you could either call that a vulnerability factor for a more recent event, or you could call that the prompting event. And you could do that. It's just that if you define the prompting event way out there, from a realistic point of view, you've got a long ways now to cover. Say, okay, well, what happened that night? What happened the next morning? What happened the next day? And so you can spend your whole session just getting a travel log, and it doesn't allow you to get deeper anywhere and choose where on the chain. So let me make just a few teaching points before we have to stop in just a very short 15 minutes for questions. So 5 more minutes of teaching and then 15 minutes of question and answer. So, I'll just make some points about what takes doing the chain to a more meaningful or clinically valuable level. And it will be a condensation of these slides. And I hate to do this. I personally don't mind doing this, but people hate me to do this because it makes you think you missed something. But actually, the way I've constructed these particular PowerPoints, there's a lot of information on PowerPoints, which is, from a teaching point of view, is not always the best way to happen because it constrains me. But the good news is that even if I don't cover all of it, you can sort of see what I've really highlight. When you're doing what I've just been describing as chain analysis, what takes it to another level? One, you're always looking for emotions. While you do the chain, remember the philosophy or theory of this treatment is that all of these behavioral problems are one way or another a result of emotional dysregulation, which could be the dysregulation of anger, or shame, or fear, or guilt, or sadness, or something else. So you're just repeatedly asking in the middle of your chain, how are you feeling when that happened? What do you think your emotion was? And you especially want the real emotions that fire first in response to something that happens, which are called primary emotions. So what do you think the emotion was? And because then people maybe shift from that emotion to another emotion, which in some ways might be an escape from the first emotion. You want to know what those primary emotions were. So that's part of how you're organizing treatment. This is a treatment of emotions and the impact of emotions in the human being. So you're always asked about emotions. That's one point. Another point, you become increasingly skillful at maintaining your assembly of the chain, so to speak, and at the same time moving on and off of it flexibly. So I'm getting my chain of events, and I become something where I actually think that this person had a better grasp of a certain skill in EBT, this would have been different. So we stop right there and I say, let's try something right here before we go on. You were really irritable at that moment with your boyfriend, is that right? Yeah, I couldn't stand it. Okay, let's talk about what you could do. What could you do if it happened again? How do you regulate irritability? What could you have done? What could you have said to him? Could you take a little time, take a little space? Could you have done a mindfulness practice? Could you have done whatever? So you move on and you do a little skills thing, which might even turn into a little role play or demonstration. This might take 1 minute, it might take 4 minutes. It might take a little longer than that. But you're smart enough because you're sort of chain oriented to say, okay, now we're going to get back on the chain. So you then reorient the patient and say, I hope this was helpful, but you know what, let's get back to Friday night. So there you were in the kitchen, getting ready to cut your supper. How are you feeling about that? What did you do next? It's sort of like you weave in and out of the story, and you do a solution or you try something to learn from it, you get back on the story, you keep going. So it's getting on and off the chain with fluidity, moving back and forth. Okay, another thing, you try to bring the chain alive. Why? Because in addition to being an assessment tool, as a treatment tool, it can be very helpful to use it for exposure purposes. So it's as if the person is going through the chain again right now. How do you do that? Well, it's partly just how you use language and how you get involved yourself. You have to get yourself in the chain. You have to say, oh my God, what happened then? Almost like, oh my God, what's happened? Suspense, now what? And you might use present tense language. That makes a big difference. So that it's in the present. Okay, so we're in the kitchen now. Notice I also use we as a pronoun sometimes instead of you. We're in the kitchen now. You're standing there. You're thinking about getting your cutting knife. Did anything else occur to you at that? Does anything else occur to you at that time? So you're really talking like a witness of the current event, which then brings alive the story and however it's represented in the brain, so that if you make any interventions, it's in the real thing, more or less. It isn't the real thing, but it's closer to the real thing than talking about history. So you bring alive your present tense language with the kind of verbs you use, with your tone, with your involvement yourself, and it makes it a more powerful, almost re-experiencing. You want to have a non-traumatic re-experiencing of this event, whatever it is. You're already doing exposure. You're not waiting until stage 2 to do exposure. You do exposure all the time, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Okay? So those are some things you do, getting on and off the chain, being flexible about how you use it. And another thing you do that I find incredibly helpful is you repeatedly paraphrase the chain. People, especially who harm themselves, but also others through your problem behaviors, it's been demonstrated in research on their cognition that people actually have terrible memories for the events around self-cutting. This was done by Mark Williams in the United Kingdom. And it's really good work. And it's sort of like people come in and you say, oh, you know, check yourself, what happened before that? They make stuff up. I mean, he did research on it. People make elaborate stories up that make complete sense, but they actually don't remember. They're confabulated, even if they aren't alcoholic, which is a very typical thing for an alcoholic. So they have bad memory, they have bad attention, they don't concentrate well, they don't have good self-observing capacities. So you want to use the chain to strengthen their capacity to accurately observe themselves. So you say things like, okay, you put it together in a way that they have trouble doing because they are the customer and they're chaotic and they're thinking about it. So you say, okay, so there you are, it's Friday, X happens. You call your friend, she's not available, right? Am I getting this right? Yeah, that's right, but it didn't quite go like that. Before dinner rather than after dinner. Okay, so before dinner, thank you for correcting me. You've got this story going now. And then after dinner, you start thinking, oh my God, I can't stand it anymore. Is that right? Yes, okay. So then you go into the kitchen where you're already thinking, oh no, I just went into the kitchen to get something to eat, and then I thought, my cutting knife. Oh, okay. So you restate the story. It has an organizing effect on somebody who's thinking is very disorganized, whose memory is bad, who doesn't pay good attention, and they're just trying to get through the session because you're making them tell the story. So you want to paraphrase it, rephrase it, make it make sense. In other words, you're taking a chaotic story, bringing it out here, packaging it around the structure of chain analysis, restating it, and putting it back inside. And now they feel like, oh, I see what happened. I'll tell you this is really helpful for in our public sector system. I'll use my last comment for now, but we'll pick up on some of these things tomorrow. Which is, I developed a risk management system for Western and Central Massachusetts in the public sector around 6 risk behaviors: self-harm, violence, fire setting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Typical things you deal with day in, day out in the public sector. And each of them was to pull together a whole assessment of how risky is this person. What are the warning signs? From data, what are the typical things we're looking for if somebody's a fire setter? In the long run and in the short run, before they're going to set a fire again or before they're going to cut themselves again. And then it goes on to a script, we don't call it behavioral analysis, but it asks the person a series of questions to spell out the script that happened. And it's basically chain analysis in the workshop. After we did this for several years, people found it pretty helpful. The kids system picked it up, modified it a little bit, and used it for kids, and God, it was a whole run. They started feeling like their staff, the kids, the families, everybody was like, this is so helpful. Just to get a story that's structured like this about chaotic events, sometimes it can be family events, use a family behavioral analysis. We could also talk a little about tomorrow, sort of an application. So, very useful thing to do in and out of DBT. We have question and answer now. At least question and question, I don't know. Questions anyway? Yeah.
Well, I have a client who gets nervous about the flashbacks. She's very good at training and flashback. And she also has
Okay, so here's somebody with flashbacks, PTSD, she has dissociative symptoms, she has flashbacks daily, and she has self-doubt in these contexts.
Recently, she hurt herself and she swallowed a key, which she used to hurt herself.
Swallowed a key?
Yeah, after she cut, because the swallowing was because she was shamed about it and she wanted to hide the key after she cut with it. She wanted to. But the point is, when I do chain analysis, flashback comes back on fully. Vaginal pain re-experiencing, and she regresses to 7-year-old, and I feel very cruel. And, if she, there's a controversy about, working on time, even though it's stage 1, because it's so, there. But at the same time, because of dissociation, it's contraindicated as well. So, kind of, playing with the idea. But the point is, when I do the chain analysis, it comes back fully on. And of course, I have to to do self-soothing or distraction or sometimes writing through it. You know, I do different things to kind of work through it. Eventually we do get to a place where it gets, you know, better, but one time didn't work because I think because of dissociation, you know, just having that level of exposure doesn't get rid of the whole experience. So without, if I were to do prolonged exposure, I would need a frame and, you know, maybe some resourcing and all that to have a containment and frame, but when I do chain analysis, I don't have that luxury. If I go through the chain, you know, it just goes in there. So I don't know how DBT, you know, looks at it and any recommendation about that.
Well, my first way of thinking about it, the first framework I had in my mind that comes up with this, is that it's another thing about the chain analysis. While you're doing a chain analysis with a patient, there's another chain going on, which is the chain between you and the patient in the room. That's a chain. 2, it is the same chain that you're analyzing, but you now are, of course, now there's 2 chains going on. And when in the second chain, which is the chain between you and the patient, you do something that cues an extremely dysregulated emotion, it interrupts the possibility of doing the first chain. And so your higher target, from a, this doesn't tell you technique yet, but from a targeting point of view, you now have in-session dysfunctional behavior, which basically means behavior in the chain of patient and therapist, which actually just jumped to the top of the hierarchy this moment because it's interfering with anything else you can do, especially if there's dissociation in the session as a result of triggers that came from the therapist. So now your attention shifts to the in-session chain, and you work on it, and there's much to be accomplished. It's, you know, by working on the in-session chain. If you think what you've done is a perfectly reasonable therapeutic technique, you didn't really jack up anything or do anything that is a terrible thing to do to somebody, which is my guess, you just did what you do with other patients, you actually don't want to remove that cue too much. But you have to balance it with the fact that if you trigger her to the point that she can't pay attention anymore, it's going to be counterproductive. So I think you're in the dialectic, and maybe there's 5 different solutions to this dialectic that we can talk about some, but it's that dialectic between how do you now readjust, recalibrate yourself to be focusing on the chain in the session. Forget the other chain. It's almost like, let it go. This is more important. So you're my patient, I say, hey, I just noticed that I'm losing you. I just noticed that I was talking to you and asking what happened about yesterday, and I feel like I'm losing you right now. Can you tell me anything about that? Person, you know, I had a patient once that would just go like this. And I would know I was, and she would be dissociated. And it would take quite a while. And then I would need to get back to, okay, I just want to remind you where you are. You're here, you're this, you're that. And even that's a little risky, because you actually don't know what's driving this behavior and whether you're reinforcing it by suddenly becoming attentive and caretaking. So it's a balancing act. And how do you just sort of say, okay, I sort of did a normal thing, but in the course of doing it, something triggered her. Probably not everything. What did it?
I'm not sure if I'm kind of pulling for dissociation. I felt like more the content of when she was talking about how, you know, I mean, this was an event where she had a pap smear done a couple of days and she was dysregulated, that was a vulnerability factor. And then there was a male patient who made sexual comments and then she got triggered, so we were analyzing that, but because the content was so intense, so I'm not sure that she was dissociating because of the connection or anything, but I thought it was more content than because I was attempting to the content and content kind of brought off the experience.
Content itself, it may have been that by the way, when you said maybe you were pulling for dissociation, that would deserve a little attention. I doubt it, but that may be a self-critical statement. I think you're probably you're creating into content that itself is provocative for her.
Right, that's right.
Okay, and if you can't treat that content in a way that helps her stay with you in the session, you might need to engage more in stimulus control. Meaning, the way that you present it, the way that you go through it, you might have to really be more attentive and modify the cue as you, the cue of how you do it. So when I'm in those situations, I might say, the last time we did something like this, it was very difficult for you. We kind of lost you in the middle. Do you remember that? I don't want to have that happen again. So let's just take this a step at a time, right? And if we can only bite off 2 or 3 links in the chain, that you can stay with me, that's a big thing. Because I want you to stay with me on this. So you need to be alert, and I need to be alert. Are we wading into territory that's really, triggering?
So as long as I do think she stayed with me, there was an observing herself in session with me. We looked like completely dissociated, but I guess my question was, we approve of this process where it will trigger, the content will trigger, and I have to do almost exposure therapy, not planned, but through the chain analysis, kind of going through it, not completely dissociated, but working through it.
When you say we approve of this process, it isn't that there's a million ways to do this process. I do approve of this process. I find it a useful organizing process of a way to investigate chaotic behavior and try to make sense of it and come up with solutions. But for some patients, they can't tolerate much. They can't tolerate much of it, so you have to modify how you do it. It's like when Melanie Harnett teaches about doing PTSD work with people's trauma memories. She says, let's say all you remember is one fragment of not one memory. You're 7 years old, you were in a closet. That's all you remember. But you know there was more to it than that, and you've heard from other people. But that's all you remember. What does she say? She'll say, just do that. Just do that. Do exposure on that one thing. And if you can find 3 memories out of severe sexual abuse as a kid and do them well, even if they're partial memories, you can make a lot of progress. And later you might get some fuller memories. I think chain analysis, when it's an exposure trigger like that, I say the same thing. If you get a fragment of the chain that you can tolerate together, analyze together, and learn a little bit of a pattern, that's better than if you plow ahead and try to do more the way we're supposed to do it, and end up with a dissociated patient. Dissociation sort of stops everything in its tracks. It's a little bit like severe shame. Severe shame interferes with massive memory, and so does dissociation. I mean, dissociation is one of the few things that Ed Boa will say it makes it the prognosis for doing trauma treatment and exposure goes way down if you've got someone who dissociates. So you've got to attend to the dissociation. That doesn't mean just be nice about it, but focus in on some thoughts. Are we there? Here?
So maybe time for one more quick question.
One more question. Anybody from the ends of the room, just to see if there's still a pulse
Okay.
All right.
So we'll see you tomorrow morning.
I